Hello everybody, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm Brian Stuart. Now you remember in Lesson 5 we were talking about the weather. But in Lesson 6 we're going to be talking about measuring the weather. So when we observe the weather, we can be more specific and talk about exactly what the weather is doing. So in this unit, you will discover weather can be measured in many ways. There's many ways to measure the weather. And we can see here, this is an instrument to measure the weather. How is it used? Well, that's another thing we will discover in this unit. Okay, before we start to talk about what the measurements are, we need to look at what does measure mean. What does it mean to measure something? There's three things we can talk about. Measure means to find the size. Size is the first thing. Speed. Speed is the second thing. And or amount. Amount is the third thing of something using a tool. So measure means to find the size, the speed, or the amount of something using a tool. And this, of course, here, this thing right here is a tool. What is this tool doing? It's measuring the size of the apple. So size, when we talk about size, we can answer the question, how big is it? How big is it? How big is this apple? We're talking about the size. Speed, in this case, we're talking about how fast is it? So we use a different tool to find out how fast something is. So we want to know the speed. Here, the amount, when we talk about amount, in this case, we can ask how much is, how much is there? How much is there? What's the amount? Is there a lot or is there a little? How much is there? So three things. One, size. How big is it? Two, speed. How fast is it? Three, amount. How much is there? We use tools to find out the answers to these questions. Tools help us observe things. When we're observing weather, we are measuring the weather. So that's what it means to measure something. Now, when we measure things, one thing about the weather we can measure is the temperature. The temperature, right? So we can measure the temperature. Temperature is how warm or cool something is. Remember, I taught you that word in Unit 5. So if we take a look at this chart, right, we have two systems for measuring temperature. In Korea, we use Celsius. In North America, especially America, they use Fahrenheit. These are differences of temperatures. These relate. 95 degrees Fahrenheit is 35 degrees Celsius. Okay? So temperature is how warm or cool something is. Obviously, this is very warm. That's very hot, isn't it? If the weather is 35 degrees Celsius, whew, that's really hot. You're sweating a lot. But if the weather, for example, is 11 degrees Celsius, then that is very cold, right? So what's the temperature? How warm or cool something is. What do we use to measure the temperature? What is the tool we use to measure the temperature? We want to know how much of something is. What is the amount? What is the amount of temperature? We use a thermometer. Thermometer. Let's repeat that. Thermometer. A thermometer is a tool used to measure the temperature. How much warmth or how little warmth is there? What's the amount? In this case, wow, it's very hot. 40 degrees, right? 40 degrees is very hot. This thermometer tells us what the temperature is. If the thermometer swings over here, this, of course, is the needle. If the needle on the thermometer is over here, it's cool or cold. If it comes over here, it's hot. So the thermometer lets us know, it helps us measure the temperature, the amount of the temperature. Let's move on. Here we have a rain gauge. A rain gauge is another tool. This is a rain gauge. It's a tool. A rain gauge is a tool used to measure how much rain has fallen. How much? What are we talking about? How much? Are we talking about size? Are we talking about speed? Are we talking about amount? How much is there? We're talking about amount. How much rain came down? We use a rain gauge, and if this fills up, we can see, that's how much rain came down. It's a rain gauge. So we use that tool to determine how much of something there is. Rain gauge. In this case, how much rain came down. We also use another tool called a wind vane. Wind vane. This is an example of a wind vane. It looks like something you'll see on a farm. Farmers like this because there are many chickens or roosters on a farm. So this is a nice or common shape for American farms. We'll have this type of wind vane. A wind vane is a tool used to measure the direction the wind is blowing. Which way is the wind blowing? So we can also talk about direction, right? Here we have west, east, south, north. So depending on which way that rooster is pointing, we can see, the wind is blowing from the west going east, or the wind is coming from the north, it's going south. Where is the wind coming from? That's the direction of the wind. We can use a wind vane to measure that, to figure out where is the wind coming from. Now, that's what I just talked about, direction. What direction? Direction is the path of something. If the wind is coming from the west and going to the east, what is the direction of the wind? It's blowing in an easterly direction, in an easterly direction. What is the direction of the wind, right? What is the direction of this man? He's going away from us. He's not coming towards us. He's going away from us. Is he going to go right? Is he going to go left? What direction is he going in? What direction is something moving in? So this is direction, the path of something. Now, blow. We can also use the word blow. Blow means to move air through space. So the wind blows. If the wind is blowing, it is moving. We can measure the direction. We can measure the speed, right? So when we talk about blow, we're talking about moving air through some space. The wind is blowing, or the wind is not blowing. It is not blowing. It is not moving. Let's take a look at our chart here. We have measuring the weather. We have different tools. We have 3 different tools on this chart. We have the name of the tool, we have a picture of the tool, and we have what the tool measures. What is the tool used for? How do we use the tool? Here we have a thermometer. A thermometer, this is a picture of a thermometer. What does a thermometer do? A thermometer measures how hot or cold something is. So when we talk about a thermometer, we're talking about, is it hot? Is it cold? We want to know exactly how hot or exactly how cold it is. We use the thermometer. It tells us exactly what we want to know. Next is a wind vane. A wind vane measures the direction of the wind. So we want to know, what is the direction of the wind? Where is the wind blowing? In which direction? We can take a look at a video of a wind vane. We have our rooster again. Let's take a look at a video. Let's see how it moves. You can see that wind doesn't always blow exactly in the same direction. It's moving a lot, right? So wind is constantly changing direction. The wind constantly changes direction, as we can see from the wind vane. And it shows us sometimes it's blowing to the west, sometimes it's blowing to the south, and it's going in between these 2 directions. So the wind has a southwesterly direction to it. Of course, it's changing a lot, but pretty much staying between west and south in this case. Okay, so we can use a wind vane to measure the direction of the wind. Coming back to our chart, we have our last tool here. This is a rain gauge. This is what a rain gauge looks like. A rain gauge measures how much rain has fallen. So if it rained a lot yesterday, you want to know how much rain came down yesterday. You use a rain gauge. It will fill up with rain and tell you, oh, it rained about 9 centimeters yesterday, or it rained 20 centimeters yesterday. It's a lot of rain. Heavy rain came down. So these are 3 tools that we use to measure the weather. Now, let's do our exercise here. We have these words here, and we have the definition. We need to match the words with the definitions. Our first definition is a tool used to measure temperature. The words are direction, thermometer, rain gauge, wind vane, measure, and temperature. So did you get it? A tool used to measure temperature, it's a thermometer, right? We use a thermometer to measure the temperature. What is the amount of the temperature? What is the amount of heat, right? Or the absence of heat. Is it cold or is it hot? We use a tool, the thermometer, to measure temperature. That is a thermometer. Number 2, how warm or cool something is. Now we're talking about how warm or cool something is, very related to number 1. In fact, they use the same word, temperature, of course. So these two are very closely related. If we talk about how warm something is or how cool something is, we're talking about the temperature. How do we measure temperature? We use a thermometer. Let's move on to number 3. A tool used to measure the direction the wind is blowing. And remember, wind usually changes direction slightly, right? So what was that tool that we saw in the video? It measures the direction of the wind. That, of course, is called a wind vane. A wind vane moves and tells us which direction the wind is blowing in. Let's take a look at number 4. A tool used to measure how much rain has fallen. So we want to know the amount of rain that came down yesterday or this morning at some point. What tool is that? We use a rain gauge. A rain gauge, a gauge is kind of a tool that measures something. It measures how much rain there is, a rain gauge. Number 5, we want to find the size, the speed, or the amount of something using a tool. What are we doing? Remember that word that we talked about at the very beginning of this lesson? We are doing something. It's a verb. We are measuring something. To measure means to find out. To find out exactly using a tool to find out the size, the speed, or the amount. How big is it? How fast is it? How much is there? Okay, number 6. The path of something. The path of something. Where is it coming from? Where is it going? What is the direction? Okay, I can't say that without giving you the word. What is the direction of something? What is the path of something? Path and direction are very similar. What is the path? What is the direction? Is the direction east? Is the path going east? What's the direction? By the way, we can say north, south, west, east. Those are directions. We can also say straight ahead, right, left, or go behind you. Those are also directions too. So we can use lots of words to talk about direction. Okay, let's take a look at this chart here. This chart is saying who studies the weather. So when we're talking about the weather, and especially when we're talking about measuring the weather, we can talk about a person whose job it is. It's their job to study the weather. They measure the weather all the time, and they want to know what the weather is doing. Who do we call those? What do we call those people? We call them a meteorologist. That's a little bit of a long word, isn't it? It's a little hard to pronounce. Meteorologist. Meteorologist. So, one more time. Meteorologist. It's kind of a difficult word. A meteorologist is a scientist. A scientist who studies the weather. Meteorologists tell us what the weather will be like tomorrow. They give us a forecast, right? I talked about that before in Unit 5. A forecast is predicting. They are making a prediction about the weather. They study the weather what the weather is doing, and they have a lot of knowledge about what weather patterns are like, so they can predict the weather. They can guess what the weather is going to do in the future. That's a prediction, a guess about the future. And from those guesses, they can give us a report about the weather in the future, and that is a forecast. They tell us what the weather will be like tomorrow. That's tomorrow's forecast. It's a prediction that meteorologists make when they study the weather. This guy looks like he's studying a hurricane, which is a weather form. He's studying how fast, the speed of the wind, and also, very important, the direction. Where is that storm going to go? Because then he can tell people in that area to be careful. So meteorologists have very important jobs. Okay, let's take a look at these different pictures. We're looking at the tools that are used in each picture, and we want to know what each tool measures. So in the first picture, we have a picture. What is this thing? Now, this is different from what we saw before. This is a tool that will move according to what? According to the wind direction. So if you chose the wind direction, that's true. It's not measuring rainfall, it's measuring the direction of the wind. I'd like to point out something here too. This right here, this part of the tool, that is measuring how fast the wind is going. So this tool actually has two parts. This part measures the direction. What is the direction? Whoops. What is the direction of the wind? And this part measures the speed. How fast is the wind? So that's interesting. This is a more modern looking wind vane, and it has two parts. It measures the direction of the wind, and this part here spins fast. If the wind is fast, it spins slowly or not at all if the wind is very slow. So it measures direction and speed of the wind. So let's take a look here. This next part, number 2, this is an instrument for measuring what? It shows us the amount of something. The amount of what? Rainfall or wind speed? Well, of course, it's measuring rainfall. How much rain fell during a certain period. This is a rain gauge. Okay, this is a rain gauge. Number 3, what is this here? First of all, what is it measuring? Is it measuring wind direction or temperature? You can see there's two sides. We have Celsius, which is a system used in Korea and most of the world, and Fahrenheit, which is a system used just basically in America. So what is it measuring? Is it measuring wind direction or temperature? Well, if you chose temperature, you are correct. What is this called? Thermometer. Thermometer. So let's review. This is a wind vane. It measures wind direction. This is a rain gauge. It measures rainfall. This is a thermometer. It measures temperature. Okay, let's move on to our true-false questions. So, circle T for true, F for false. First one, people use a thermometer to measure the temperature of the air. So we're using a thermometer to measure temperature. Remember, these words are very closely related, and that's true. Absolutely. We use a thermometer to measure the temperature. Temperature is how hot or how cold something is. We want to know what the air temperature is. How hot is the air? How cool or cold is the air? We use a thermometer to figure that out, to measure it. Number 2, people use a wind vane to measure the speed of wind. So a wind vane, that's interesting. Do we use a wind vane that moves with the direction of the wind to measure the speed of wind? No, we don't. We use a different tool. Now, that tool that I showed you had two parts, right? The top part was the wind vane. That showed us the direction of the wind. That's the wind vane. But the bottom part that spins around, that's not a wind vane. That's just that's a different part of the tool. It's not the wind vane part. The wind vane moves according to the direction of the wind, but it doesn't tell us the speed of the wind. Okay, it just shows us the direction of the wind. Number 3, a rain gauge can be used to measure which direction the wind is blowing. So a rain gauge can be used to measure the direction of the wind? No, because we just saw in number 2 that a wind vane is used to measure the direction of the wind, not a rain gauge, so that's false. If we change this to wind vane, it would be correct. A wind vane. So, a wind vane can measure the direction of the wind. Which direction is the wind blowing? We use a wind vane to show us. And of course, so that we have to change the sentence, that sentence is false, not true. Okay, well, let's take a break here. Let's move on to the reading section. Okay, welcome back. Let's go over the reading. Now, this article is going to be talking about measuring the weather and especially about the tools used to measure the weather. We can see that in the first sentence. People can use tools to measure weather. That's our topic sentence. Our subject is here, tools, and we use those tools to measure the weather. Remember, we can measure things in many different ways. Weather can be measured in many ways. We're talking about size, speed, and amount. And of course, we're talking about that here. One way to measure is to find the temperature of the air, the amount of heat or the absence of heat. That's the temperature of the air. How hot is it? How cold is it? Temperature is the measure of how hot or cold something is. So how hot is it? How cold is it? We're talking about temperature. What do we use to measure the temperature? What is the tool used to measure the temperature? Well, people can use a thermometer to measure the temperature of the air. So this is the tool that we use to measure the temperature. Another thing we can measure is how much rain has fallen. People can also measure how much rain has fallen. So how much rain? What is the amount? How much rain has fallen? A rain gauge is the tool that we use to measure the amount of rain that has fallen. Here we see the example, we see the picture again of how much rain has fallen. If it's full, that's a lot of rain fell. But if it's very little, not very much rain fell. So we can measure that, right? How much of an amount? How much has fallen? Okay, we can also measure the direction and the speed of the wind. Not only can we measure the direction, we can also measure how fast is the wind. What is the speed of that wind? The direction the wind is blowing. Remember, wind blows, moves from one place to another. Air moves, it's blowing. The direction can be measured by a wind vane. Okay, this is a good video of another wind vane. We can see it in action here. Let's see how it's moving. You can hear the wind, can't you? It's really blowing. Now this part of the machine over here is a wind vane. It's showing us the direction in which the wind is blowing. Okay, so this part is the wind vane. Now we talked about this tool over here that's used to measure the speed of the wind. It is not a wind vane. What is it? Well, let's spell it out here. A-N-E-M-O-M-E-T-E-R. And then anemometer, anemometer, anemometer. It's a little difficult of a word to say, anemometer. So an anemometer is the tool that we use to measure the speed of the wind. How fast is the wind going? And you saw that little thing spinning around. If it spins faster, the wind speed is higher. If it spins slower, the wind speed is slower. So this is the anemometer, and this is the wind vane. Okay, so let's do a little bit of summary. We're talking about the different tools that are used to measure the weather. Now we have three tools that we talked about. First we talked about the thermometer. That's the first tool we talked about. The second was the rain gauge, and the third was the wind vane. So 1, 2, 3. This is kind of a summary statement. We're wrapping up these tools. 1 thermometer, 2 rain gauge, 3 wind vane. They are all tools used to measure the weather. How hot is it? How much rain fell? What's the direction of the wind? These are all tools we use to measure the weather. So we can break down our reading passage. into this type of skill. Main idea in details, right? We're talking about tools. What are the tools used for? For measuring the weather. And we can talk about what each tool is used for specifically. What exactly are we measuring? So, our topic sentence, weather can be measured in many ways. There's many different ways. We can divide 3 different areas or 3 different ways that we're measuring the weather. First of all, we have the first way, the second way, and the third way. Remember, I showed you on the summary slide. We need to fill in the blanks here with these words at the bottom. First word or first phrase, rain gauge, rain gauge, temperature, wind vane, and thermometer. So we have 4 choices at the bottom. Let's fill them in. A, it's missing, so we need to continue on the sentence, is the measure of how hot or cold something is. Okay, so the measure of how hot or cold it is, we are talking about what? We're talking about the temperature, right? Temperature is the measure of how hot or how cold it is. Temperature. What do we use as a tool to measure the temperature? Something is a tool for measuring it, the temperature. So what do we use to measure the temperature? It's over here, isn't it? We use a thermometer. A thermometer is a tool that we use to measure how hot or cold it is. It's the same as saying to measure the temperature. The second one we talked about in the reading passage, we can measure how much rain has fallen. What do we use for that? We use, of course, a rain gauge. We use a rain gauge to find out how much rain has fallen. Finally, the direction of wind can be measured by what? Do we use a rain gauge? No. Temperature? No. A wind vane? Yes. A wind vane tells us the direction of the wind. So we use a wind vane to tell us, to measure the direction, which way the wind is blowing. Okay, let's talk about the reading comprehension questions. Number 1, a meteorologist, right? Difficult word. Meteorologist is someone who studies the what? Remember we talked about meteorologist? We saw a picture of somebody. He was looking at the computer screens. What was he studying? Was he studying people, weather, or tools? Of course, the subject of our unit is weather, so if you chose weather, you're correct. But it's true, a meteorologist studies weather. They don't study people, they don't study tools, they use tools to study the weather, especially to measure the weather and make predictions about the weather. Okay, let's move on to number 2. Temperature is the measure of how beep something is. So we have our choices, warm or cool, B, wet, C, fast. Temperature is the measure of how warm or cool something is. That's correct, isn't it? Our choice is A. B, temperature is the measure of how wet something is? No, we're talking about perhaps humidity, right? Humidity would tell us how wet something is. Humidity. If we talk about the humidity, we can talk about how wet the air is, how wet some area or region is. If it has high humidity, it's wet. Not a lot of humidity, it's dry. So that would be humidity, not temperature. Fast? No, fast would be speed. So we'd have to change that to speed, right? Speed is the measure of how fast something is, right? That would be correct. So we would have to change this word with these for these two to be correct. So temperature, we're talking about warm or cool. How warm or cool something is. Let's move on to number 3. A rain gauge can measure how much rain has fallen. Now, here we have the next part of the sentence. One of them starts with but, 2 of them starts with and. That's important. Let's take a look. A rain gauge can measure how much rain has fallen, but, on the other hand, in the opposite way, it cannot measure temperature. Is that true? A rain gauge measures how much rain has fallen? That's true. But it can't measure temperature. That is true. So A is our correct answer. What about B? And it can also measure wind direction. So it can measure how much rain has fallen and also wind direction? No. Rain gauge is only used for one thing, how much rain has fallen. It can't also measure wind direction, right? And notice it uses and, so that means also, but this one uses but, so it cannot do that. It can only do one thing. C, and measures the same as a thermometer? No, it doesn't measure the temperature. It doesn't measure how hot or cold something is, so C is not correct either. A is our correct choice. On number 4, some tools used to measure the weather are, so we're talking about the names of different tools. What are some tools that we use to measure the weather? A, do we use a meteorologist and a scientist to measure the weather? Can we use those people? Hey, come here, I want to use you to measure the weather. That sounds really weird, right? Another problem is a meteorologist and a scientist, it's the same thing. That's like saying we use a ruler and a ruler to measure how long something is. It's the same thing. We don't need to repeat. So A is not our correct answer. B, a wind vane and a thermometer. So one tool is a wind vane, another tool is a thermometer. Is that true? We can use a wind vane and a thermometer to measure the weather? Sure, that's what we're talking about in this unit. These are some tools we use to measure the weather. So B is the correct answer. C, we use rainfall, temperature, and wind speed. Are these tools? They're not tools. They're things that we measure about the weather. They're things about the weather that we do measure, but they are not tools, so they can't be the right answer either. B, of course, is our correct answer. Okay, let's move on to our last slide showing the chart that we saw before. These are 3 different tools. We just talked about what are some tools that we use to measure the weather. So here we have the picture and here we have the description. We need to fill in the labels. We have a picture here of something that measures how hot or cold something is. You're measuring the temperature. What do you use to measure the temperature? You use a thermometer. This is a picture of a thermometer. In the second part, we have a tool here that measures the direction of the wind. This thing turns and shows us the direction the wind is blowing. What is it called? It's called a wind vane. Shows us the direction of the wind. Finally, we have a picture of a tool here that's used to measure how much rain has fallen. This tool measures how much rain has fallen. What is it? It, of course, is a rain gauge. So we have 3 different tools that we use to measure the weather. So in this unit, we looked at a lot of different tools. How do we measure the weather? We can look outside and say it's rainy, it's snowy, or it looks like a clear day, looks like a warm day, but we want to know exactly how hot it is, exactly how cold it is, exactly how much rain has fallen, how much wind is blowing, and what direction. In this case, we use tools. We saw different types of tools that we can use to measure the weather. And remember, a meteorologist is someone who studies the weather. He or she uses these tools to make predictions about the weather. So, it's a very interesting lesson. Hope you've learned a lot as usual. We'll see you next time. Take care.